Hello and welcome to the Extremis Publishing podcast. I'm Tom Christie. My guest today is Mr. Robert Murray, who's the author of The Grocer's Boy, A Slice of His Life in 1950 Scotland, and The Spirit of Robbie Burns. And today, Robbie is going to be discussing with us his 5 favourite books, the 5 texts which have left the greatest impact on him over the years. Thanks for joining us today, Robbie.
Thank you, Tom.
Now, the first book that you've chosen is Flight Path by Peter Masefield. What is it about this book particularly which has meant a lot to you?
I think the background to this for me is the fact that this gentleman, Peter Masefield, by the way, a cousin of John Masefield, as it happens, but it was nothing to do with that made me pick this book off the library shelf. This man went to Cambridge University. He got his degree in engineering. He chose a path to go to become an apprentice in an aircraft factory. He wanted to, this was his passion, flying. And he went back to the very roots of the engineering world as an apprentice. He started writing aeronautical pieces while he was doing this. And in fact, one of the things he did was he reorganised the entire aircraft recognition systems for the whole of Britain just prior to and the early stages of the Second World War. He rewrote, because the aircraft recognition system across the country was in various elements or various stages of development. He pulled it all together and made a huge impact in improving that. He wrote regular aero news items, and through these aero news items he was drafted in to help Lord Beaverbrook, no less, who was working as a one-man committee with Churchill. And Peter Masefield became a working colleague of Lord Beaverbrook. And the challenge they had, and I found this amazing, that the project was to plan the future of civil aviation for Britain after the Second World War. And so while all the bombs and the troubles were going on, here we have this committee working away on this. Peter Masefield was sent to the USA, and he swatted absolutely everything up about flying, aircraft, future designs, every element of flying and came back to the UK with all of this and built up the future policy basically for this country in civil aviation. And so this man was dedicated to flying. He eventually became chairman of BAA, British Aircraft Authority, and he was not re-elected. It was something to do with the fact that he had very strong views about where the third Heathrow airstrip should be built, and for some strange reason, some political elements in there, he was not reappointed, which was very sad. But there's a very interesting story about Peter Masefield, if I may have time just to say something about this. He used to fly his small plane wherever he went on business, and on this one occasion he had to go to Inverness. As he was leaving Inverness Airport, a man approached him and said, I've lost my train connections, can you give me a lift? Because Peter Masefield was on his way back to the south of England. And this gentleman said, fine, not a problem. On the way there was a storm, and Peter Masefield decided to land at Montrose Airport. And just as they were coming into the approaches, in front of Peter Masefield was a biplane which wings collapsed, the plane plummeted to the ground, the man he was giving a lift to, sitting in behind him, screamed, and Peter Masefield turned round and there was no man there. It turns out that Montrose Airfield, from the early days of pioneering RFC days, Montrose was a training base, and this pilot his name was Desmond Arthur. He was the pilot, and he was lost, and there was two or three inquiries as to the cause of the accident which resulted in his death. Peter Masefield was able to say he'd seen this plane, and this was something that came back from history, that Desmond Arthur had died, and he was trying to tell the world how he had died. The spooky thing about this was the flight that was being made by Peter Masefield was the 27th of May 1963, exactly to the day 50 years after Desmond Arthur's crash and killed. So Peter Masefield was I admired his path. He calls it the flight path, but his own path and what he did and his contribution all through these difficult times, and how he made himself such a huge authority. Sadly, he fell downstairs and in an accident at home and died prematurely in his early 90s. But I thought it was an excellent story of a man who was dedicated to his passion of flight.
Britain's aviation history has been an important subject which has been addressed by many books. What is it you feel particularly about Flight Path that makes it stand out against other books of this type?
I think he had to, working with Lord Beaverbrook and Churchill, one can imagine the challenge and the pressure and the demanding circumstances within which he had to work, and the extremely high levels of his technical know-how, his technical knowledge. He reached the highest level probably in the world in one man, and he made it his mission to get to that level, and it was a huge plus. He was eventually knighted and for his efforts and all of this, but it was his determination and his personal demands on himself to reach that high level.
Now, the next book that you've chosen is The Fox and the Flies by Charles Van Onselen. Interesting book. What particularly attracted you to it?
Well, this is an entirely different story, but the character is all about a man by the name of Joseph Silver. This is a fascinating story because Charles Van Onselen, a South African historian, by accident had seen something on a desk in his office in Johannesburg relating to the name Joseph Silver. And I think Charles Van Onselen had been perhaps tinkering with some ideas about characters. But this story starts where Silver, and he had many names, this man, Silver, had started off as he became a nasty piece of work. He was a burglar, a gun runner, a jewel thief, a rapist, a safecracker, you name it, and strangely enough, a police informer. But he was also a psychopath and a racketeer. He was a nasty piece of work. The author of this book has traced Joseph Silver, having left Eastern Europe, came to London, and he was able to track all of the Joseph Silver's movements by some very clever means. And through the 1888-1889 period, this Joseph Silver, otherwise alias Joseph List, moved around in shady circles in London. For some reason he left London and he went off to the States, and it became clear that he was trading in England with the thieves, gun runners, burglars, rapists, and one of his main sources of his income was the shady dealings with human slave labour. We hear something of that these days with slave labour and the sex trade and so on and so forth. And this was what Joseph Silver was doing in the late 19th century. He actually, in the US, became a police informer as well. So he was a very clever man living on his wits. He eventually went to South Africa, and all of this trading and his racketeering went on in South Africa. He always seemed to move for some strange reason, but the author managed to track him down eventually to the Argentine. Later on, he was actually captured in 1918 and shot as a spy. Probably could or could not have been a spy, but he was shot at the age of 50. And what's intriguing about this for me is that the author had done a huge amount of research, and I was just so impressed by the amount of research that he'd done. In the last chapter, he places Joseph Silver as the man in London who's the most likely person to have been Jack the Ripper, and everything fitted. I don't think the author himself knew where he was going with the story, but when he'd done all the research and worked exactly everything through inch by inch, the inescapable fact was that this was the man. So what appeals to me about this story is a nasty piece of work. I'm not impressed by him at all, but I'm impressed by the research done by the author. And what I liked about it was standing out in the last chapter was, of course, Jack the Ripper. And there have been many books written and theories about Jack the Ripper, and I haven't read them all, but this was such a compelling background story of one man who, for me, seems to be the one that ticks most of the boxes as being Jack the Ripper.
Now, as you rightly say, books about Jack the Ripper have been plentiful over the years. What is it about Van Onselen's evidence that you find particularly persuasive?
His detail, the forensic approach to the detail, and he's spent so long in compiling this detail. The records, he's gone back to shipping records in the United States, in Argentina and London. He's got bills of lading, and he's got passenger lists. All that was done painstakingly to bring this book together. So that's quite I thought that was quite a feat. It's a huge piece of work.
So there's a change of pace with the next book that you've chosen, and that is The Man Who Would Not Die by Lucky Herschel McKee. Different kind of book.
Yes, Lucky Herschel McKee, born 1897 in America, young boy at the time when he was playing around on his contraptions, scooters and gadgets he liked to do daredevil things with. He was always in trouble. As a youngster, he did amazing things and took huge risks. He was having scrapes and bumps and bruises as a young boy. But he became intrigued by the war that was going on in Europe, and being a young, wild, fearless youngster in the United States, he wanted to get into the action in Europe, and he, as many US flying personalities wanted, he got into the Lafayette Flying Corps in France, and he became one of their ace killers. He had a greater number of kills than any of his colleagues, and he became really excellent at this job. He crashed and was captured and escaped, and eventually found himself in the trenches. So he was a man who didn't need to be in Europe, didn't need to be fighting a war necessarily. He'd gone off to join his dream of flying, and the one place to do it was in the First World War. Having escaped and gone through the trenches, he had seen a lot of nasty things. And later on, after the war, he went back to racing, into motor racing. And the reason he's called The Man Who Wouldn't Die is not because of how he managed only to escape in the European situation, but on his racing track in Minneapolis, he was fearless. And on these races, the driver has a co-driver, and they spend many years as a co-driver before you actually are able to take to the wheel. He did all of this and was in several serious accidents, nearly breathing his last on many occasions. So he gave up the racing and went back to flying. He met a friend and comforted himself with some flying. When I got to the end of this book, it was so sad. He had a daughter, and he hadn't seen much of his family life. He'd done all the things that he wanted to do. His wife and his daughter, he hadn't seen much of them. And at the end, when he died, and you get to the stage in the book when this happens, I was left with this huge feeling of a huge spirited man with a huge heart, and all his personality bound up into one thing. And when the story came, I was quite saddened and quite emotional about the death of Lucky Herschel McKee. At long last, the poor man died, but he had a huge history of near scrapes, and it was such a sad ending, because I wanted him to keep going. I wanted him to keep doing all the marvellous adventurous things in life that he'd been pursuing, and only one thing stopped him, was old age and finally death. But I think he would have kept going forever if he'd had the chance.
With American involvement in the Second World War being the subject of so many books, I think that sometimes American involvement in the Great War is a subject that can be overlooked. How do you feel McKee's book rates in comparison with other books of that type?
I haven't read too many of them, Tom, to be perfectly honest, but I think it's very much an individual story. Of course, we've all read the adventures and the conflict, and the mass starvations and mass poverty and the mass movement of people brought about by the Second World War. But this was just one man who was born to be a daredevil. I could see that in the very early stages of the story, but he channeled it. He channeled it into making something of his life, and that's what I think is a different take on a story.
Well, we're making a return to South Africa with your next book, which is Rogue, the Inside Story of SARS by Johan van Loggerenberg and Adrian Lackey.
Yes, Tom, the SARS, the inside story, SARS is South African Revenue Services. I have a great deal of emotion when I talk about South Africa. I've visited South Africa on many occasions, more than a dozen occasions probably. I was first there when my friend back home in Carnoustie invited me, and he showed me around South Africa, took me on a great trip. I began to learn more and more about the country, and of course I went to Robben Island. For my part, I was interested to see the cell where Nelson Mandela had been incarcerated for 27 years. Through Alan and my journeys and my subsequent trips to South Africa, I began to pick up a lot of the pluses about South Africa. A marvellous country, beautiful countryside, great variations of geographical interest, a vibrant country. And the population today go about their business, all very happily working away on day-to-day street level in shops and restaurants. It's a wonderful place to be. Sadly, behind the scenes, I describe it as a South African diamond with a flaw in the middle somewhere. The diamond is the climate, the quality of life. Sadly, there's a whole raft of bad things that are happening in South Africa. We hear about the corruption. So we have a level of national government, provincial government, municipalities, but we've also got a layer of tribal chiefs. If they don't like the laws and they don't like the discipline of these laws, they'll go their own way. So SARS, to come back to this, was a unit inside the government, and there was an elite crime-busting unit within SARS. The purpose of this unit was to suss out rogue dealings, money changing hands, and I'm not talking small money, it's massive money. And there was tobacco imports, there was computer frauds, a whole range of highly lucrative scams that some people were getting up to. But the crime busting unit was intriguing because the unit was subsequently and very carefully dismantled by government bodies and agencies working behind the scenes to discredit this crime busting unit because it was getting too close to the truth. I think in many cases that is the case. So by means of television, Sunday Times exposures, all of this being false, talk about fake news as we hear nowadays, a lot of fake news was being pumped out into the world in South Africa and beyond that, no doubt. But this was a tale of a dedicated team who were actually doing an exceedingly clever, dangerous job. Some of the people in that unit were ex-military people with honours and bravery and seeking. Some of them didn't see their families for months on end. They were working undercover, cutting out the corruption and the crime and the nasty businesses that were going on. Sadly, at the end of all of this, the people inside that unit lost their jobs. They were discredited. All this publicity that was pumped out fundamentally wiped out the elite crime-busting unit. They were discredited, sacked, and never really would find themselves a job again in South Africa.
Now, South Africa is a country with an enormously sophisticated cultural and social history. Did Van Logrenberg's book encourage you to read more about it, or was it somewhere that you already had a deep interest in terms of literature?
I think it put, Tom, a factual situation into the context of the wider world of South Africa. It gave me some idea of the mechanics of how a properly run, and believe, I'm aware that South Africa has got a very well written constitution, and everything they have on paper is superbly well written. It's the execution of all of that is the problem. And SARS was an excellent, as indeed I think on paper as good as our revenue services. But this unit was fighting a dangerous game, and so it gave me the inside mechanics of how this unit was working against the wider picture of what we know. So yes, it was an insight into that. It confirmed to me, yes, there is a problem. Yes, probably the politicians who were in some corrupt aspects of this were fearful that this unit was getting a bit too close to their own doorstep. So for me, that was a nice inside story.
And for your final book, we take a return a bit closer to home with The Spirit of Angus by John McGregor, a historical tale.
Yes, John McGregor's book is all about the 5th Battalion of the Black Watch. The 5th Battalion was a battalion made up of territorials. I read this book because one of my senior colleagues in my workplace had actually been awarded the military medal for his work in the Second World War, particularly El Alamein and the work of the battalion, 5th Battalion Black Watch. I casually mentioned to him one day that my uncle, Jim, had died at El Alamein, strange enough, on the day after my birthday. I was 2 when he died, and I had this connection with this Uncle Jim. He'd come to see me when I was a 2-year-old baby in Barry, near Carnoustie here, and I've always had this connection. My mum actually dug out a suit out of a wardrobe once and said it was Uncle Jim's suit, and I wore it because it fitted me to a T when I was going to church. The story of the 5th Battalion was the origins when they were a collection of young, fit men who wanted to go to war at the Second World War. They wanted to fight. They started off running through woods and doing exercises, marching and exercises in Banchory. They came to Ballybudden near Carnoustie. I read the story of how, in actual fact, they had no money, practically no money, as they were in this embryonic stage. My Uncle Jim was a carpenter to trade. It doesn't say it in the book, but I know that in the book it says they had to make beds for the officers in tents. They had no sleeping quarters. They had to borrow dixies. You know what I mean by that. It's large cooking pots. They had to go to friends in Dundee who were in the grocery or the butchery trade and beg and borrow, not borrow, but beg for food. And so it was all on a shoestring. This small group eventually moved from running around the woods with wooden rifles, actually found themselves being trained in England, ready to fight. They went to Camberley. They were trained and they were spruced up into a fighting unit. They went on the SS Empress of Australia. The story, they sail from Liverpool. They don't know where they're going, but we know in the book they're going to Egypt. The fascinating bit about this is there were, I think the SS Liverpool, Empress of Australia, could originally take about 1,500 passengers and 500 crew, but the troops they carried on this trip to Egypt was 3,500 on board. So they took turns of sleeping on deck, and they practiced their firing skills, shooting skills while they were training. Uncle Jim was killed, as I said earlier on. This story gives me the whole picture of a group of young men with no skills other than their own jobs which they'd worked at. They wanted to fight. It's a trace of going from practically nothing into being a unit which fitted in on the battle night at El Alamein. And some of the elements of the story, and one of the things I'd never learned until I read The Spirit of Angus, was that the troops, the Black Watch and other foot soldiers, marched the whole night before the El Alamein barrage happened. They walked all night. They had to march 3 strides. 3 strides was 2 yards. They knew they had to walk 3 miles. They had to count these strides on the way. They dug themselves in a pit, 2 men to a pit in the sand, covered themselves up, and they lay there for a whole day. And the next day, when it was dark, they were up, and the barrage started about 9:40 on the night of the 23rd, and Uncle Jim was there. So I've got a personal tale that I like to know what Uncle Jim did before, during, and at the end of this whole adventure. And that's what the book is all about. It encapsulates, as it says, the spirit of Angus, a group of young men who gave their lives. Many of them gave their lives, and this is a nice story. Strangely enough, Uncle Jim's brother, Tom, was in the Navy, and he was in a ship at Sierra Leone. And when he had heard that the Empress of Australia was docking for stores and fuel, he realised his brother was on the ship. He got special allowance to get on and meet up. The 2 brothers met, and that was the last time these 2 brothers saw each other, both in a wartime situation. So it's a family connection for me. Uncle Jim's a hero. He was the Batman for the Lieutenant Colonel. A straightforward young man, died at the age of 21. And this story gives me the entire story about the 5th Battalion and all of their exploits, but it's not in the book about my Uncle Jim, obviously, but I'm able to relate Uncle Jim's experiences and his adventures within that context.
Well, Scotland has a long and proud military history, and Angus is most certainly no exception. What is it about MacGregor's book that makes you feel that you've glimpsed that very particular insight into what life was like during the conflict?
I think it's the characters, it's the strength of characters the determination and the controlled professionalism. We talk today about career paths and things that people do, and they're on this career or that career. But we've got to remember, in the Second World War, the collection of people put together had their own professions back home, whether they were desk-bound or manual people, woven together as a group of people, the characters and the strength of these characters and the relationships that they built up. We all know in wartime that must be different. They're facing a common foe and everything's different. But it was a huge, I think for me, I'm not saying this doesn't exist in other parts of the UK, but for me, knowing the names and seeing the Scottish names coming up and the characters and the strength of characters is one can see that is at the root of a victory for any battle. And that's exactly what happened here.
One thing that suggests itself from looking at all 5 of your favourite books is the commonality of the biographical and autobiographical element of them. Now, is the biography a genre that means a lot to you?
I've read fiction, of course. Everything from Conan Doyle and Neville Shute in the young days, and yes, I have. I keep coming back to autobiographical books because this is a wide selection of tales to tell, and I just like hearing about people, and I like to know what makes people tick, and whether it's Peter Masefield and his attention to detail and making himself the best authority in the world in civil aviation is one way of putting it. The people in the Rogue unit, you have to admire the risks that these people took. There's no doubt Spirit of Angus is a collection of people. And of course I then come on to Herschel McKee. He was a flamboyant character, and I was as sad for him as anybody else, although he was a real adventurous man. These people have all got a huge contribution. When I come to The Fox and the Flies, it's about a nasty piece of work, but what appeals to me there is not the character in the book, but appeals to me the author who put together such a detailed analysis of that story.
Well, Robbie, it's often said that truth is sometimes stranger than fiction, but I think today you've shown us it can also be informative, interesting and exciting. Thank you very much for taking the time to share with us your 5 favourite books.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you.
Robbie's books, The Grocer's Boy and The Spirit of Robbie Burns, are available to buy from all good independent retailers and online booksellers worldwide. Thank you for joining us today. I hope that you'll tune in again soon.